Whatever happened to Gary Cooper? The strong, silent type. That was an American. He wasn't in touch with his feelings. He just did what he had to do. See, what they didn't know is once they got Gary Cooper in touch with his feelings, that they wouldn't be able to shut him up. And then it's dysfunction this, and dysfunction that, and dysfunction malfungo.
You have strong feelings about this.
Let me tell you something. I had a semester and a half of college, so I understand Freud. I understand therapy as a concept. But in my world, it does not go down.
You know, have you ever heard anyone speak before, and when they're speaking with full certainty? And when I say certainty, not just confidence, you know, but they're speaking in a way where there's no curiosity. They're speaking in a way where there's no hesitation. There's no sort of mediation on what's being shared. And most importantly, no humility, and there's no awareness that there may be more to the matter than what they can actually perceive or what they actually can see. And you'll find that the strange thing to that is the more limited that person's understanding is, the more confident they seem to become, you know. And I wanted to share something on that today because speaking about growth and dynamics and things like that, and the things that the type of work that I do and what this channel will come to represent more of, I think that this is an important docking point, you know, in the beginning. You know, I entitled this particular segment, "The Fool's Confidence." And it's because one of the most dangerous things that you'll find in the world is not necessarily ignorance, you know, because ignorance can be educated. Ignorance can become wisdom if you have a person who is humble enough to learn, right? The real danger is when ignorance thinks that it's wisdom, right? So the dangerous person in that instance, they don't even know, you know, and they don't know that they don't know. So that then builds an entire identity around being right. You know, when you have people say things like, "I don't know," and "I don't want to know," right? So you not only do you not know what's happening, but you don't know that you do not know what's happening. And then you build an identity around not knowing what you do not know, right? And I'll if that was a little bit of a twister for you, I'm going to get into it, you know. And much of what I'm sharing is inspired by the German philosopher, author Schopenhauer. He's someone who I've been reading since I first started, you know, reading things that were interesting to me. And I liked it. I liked his works. He's got some very interesting concepts on just race and relations and cognitive theory. But he had a very sharp eye for this particular phenomenon by itself. And he sort of understood that many people aren't just wrong. You know, sometimes we're very sophomoric in kindergarten, if you will, in our diagnosis of people where they're right or they're wrong. But a lot of times there's more layers to it than that. And sometimes people are trapped inside the limits of their own perception, right? And they can't see the depths of what they're missing. So what happens is that they mistake their very shallow view for the entire truth, right? And I think today in modern times, you find that issue everywhere. It's in organizations, it's in spiritual communities, it's in family conflicts, it's in politics, it's in relationships, it's in especially social media. You know, you see it pretty much every minute of the day in social media. People aren't just sharing their opinions anymore. They're performing certainty. And certainty, when it's not rooted in wisdom, then certainty becomes destructive. You know, so it's important to sort of understand. I'm going to try to break this up a little bit. The ignorant mind, it can't see what it lacks. So Schopenhauer spoke about that, and he saw that the fool is usually confident because the fool can't perceive complexity, right? So that's an important point to hinge on for a moment, because that alone causes a lot of damage. A person who only has a surface level understanding of something usually thinks that that particular thing is very simple. So they'll look at a marriage and they'll think and say, "Oh, I know what happened," because they only have surface information. Or they'll look at a business and they'll say, "Oh, I know why this place closed down. I know why they failed." They may look at a religion or a spiritual system and immediately they'll think like, "Oh, I did that. I understand that. I know what that's all about." And they'll look they could look at a situation between people or another person, and they're immediately like, "Oh, I know who the villain is. I know who the villain is," but they don't know. They don't know at all. And they only know the small fragment that they were shown. So they know the story that was most convenient to them. And what I mean by the story that's most convenient to them, they know the piece that matched with what they already wanted to believe, you know, and because they can't see the larger structure, they hold that little piece as the whole of the matter. And that's what we call illusion. You know, a shallow mind doesn't experience its own shallowness as a limitation. A shallow mind experiences its shallowness as clarity, right? So that's why you'll hear someone who will give a very simple explanation for a complex sort of situation. And in those moments, you might think to yourself, how could you be so certain? This thing is layered. This thing is hot, it's complex. How are you so certain? But from inside of their own mind, that type of individual, they feel clear. They feel like they're very clear. They feel righteous. They feel informed, right? Now you may ask yourself, well, why? Based on all those other things that I just described. Because they don't know enough to know what they are missing. The reality is that and I think about some of the writings of Schopenhauer that sort of inspired this thought. There's a framed pattern where people confuse certainty with intelligence, and they have very limited knowledge, and that limited knowledge can make everything appear very simple, than it really is. So now that's the beginning of what we call the fool's confidence, right? Because what occurs is they're not moving on wisdom, they're not moving on knowledge, they're not moving even on discernment. They just have the inability to perceive depth. It's like going to the pool and you can only see 3 feet down. So you're thinking, oh, the pool is only 3 feet, but it's a 6 foot or a 7 foot deep pool. You can't swim. So you say, oh, I can go in that water. I'm 5'8", I'm 5'9", and that's only 3 feet. I can jump right in. And someone who's more trained, or the lifeguard who's there, is like, no, it's deeper than what you perceive. And you're like, I'm looking right at it. It's only 3 feet, right? So a lot of times people, they don't have the ability to perceive depth, right? And then there's another part to this. There's familiarity. And sometimes people mistake familiarity for expertise. And I think in today's times, that's probably one of the most prevailing modern diseases. I've had many of my clients who've spoken to me who've had challenges at work or challenges in their family. And it's based around that same idea, especially those who have decided to pursue maybe a life where it's more examined, where they take a greater philosophical approach or analysis to their own living experience, and they may be around people who don't. They may work with people who don't. They may have family members who don't. And it's very difficult for those people to recognize them. And they get into very frustrating back and forth. I've been there before. I understand. A person who watches a few videos, or who reads a few posts, or who listens to a couple of podcasts, they may hear a few terms, and they hear just enough to become dangerous, and because now they feel qualified to speak with authority because they've been exposed to a couple of things. They've heard the language. So now they think, because I've heard the language, I understand the discipline. There's a major difference between being familiar with something and actually knowing something. And there are people who don't understand familiarity means only that you have been exposed to a thing. That's it. I've lived in a place before where there was a horse farm. Not farm in particular, but you could go horseback riding nearby. There were stables nearby. I really don't know the first thing about caring for a horse, or maintaining a horse, or even breeding them. I don't know anything. But I would drive past these stables every single day when I would drive to work. And sometimes they would have the horses. There was a trail along the road where they would walk, and I would see the horses. But so I was familiar with them. I was exposed to them, but I didn't have any expertise around horses, right? So expertise means that you can work with a thing. Expertise means that you can test a thing. Expertise means that you can apply that particular thing. And very importantly, when you have expertise in something, you can defend it against challenge. You can recognize when that particular thing is being misused, right? So a person may be familiar, for instance, in my field, psychology. I'm an organizational psychologist. A person may be familiar with psychology, but it doesn't mean that they understand psychology, right? A person may be familiar with a religious scripture, but it doesn't mean that they have the wisdom. So you can be familiar with scripture without having any wisdom, right? You can be familiar with business language without knowing how to actually build a business. You see, in many instances, some of the people I work with, they are familiar with trauma language, but they're not actually emotionally mature, right? You can be familiar with spirituality and never be transformed by spirituality, So that's where the ego creeps in. That's where the ego comes in. The ego loves familiarity. And it's because familiarity gives the ego a feeling of intelligence without requiring any discipline. It lets a person say, I know about that. Yeah, I know what that is. I know about that. But knowing about something and knowing something are not the same thing, right? And I think that in today's time, that's particularly dangerous at a different level, because social media, the algorithms of social media, it rewards speed, right? It rewards reaction. It rewards confidence. It rewards emotional certainty. The algorithm of emotion of social media does not reward careful study. The algorithm doesn't reward patience. The algorithm doesn't reward humility, and the algorithm does not reward um, long-term observation. So we've created a culture where a person, whoever speaks the fastest, will usually sound more convincing than the person who thinks deeply. And if you've had experiences, true, authentic experiences with wisdom, you'll know that wisdom very rarely moves fast. Wisdom takes long pauses. Wisdom asks questions. Wisdom seeks patterns, right? And wisdom checks its own assumptions. Wisdom knows first that impressions that you may get, like we say, first impressions are everything. Wisdom knows that first, those first impressions are usually incomplete. The fool doesn't have any of those checkpoints I just said. None of them. The fool hears a phrase, then grabs a label, finds a crowd to agree with them, and then mistakes agreement for truth. Everybody said, so they said it too. So, but that's when you know you're hearing from a fool. The fool, it's another important one, and this is what I've dealt with my clients a lot. Fools don't recognize masters. Schopenhauer spoke about that. It was something very important that he kind of said: to recognize excellence, you need competence yourself, right? Um, I'm a person, I have been playing instruments pretty much my entire life. You know, uh, if I, since the age of 7, but even prior to that, but 7 was when I really, it's like, this is what I'm going to do, Um, but not only playing instruments, studying music, not only studying music, studying instruments, how they're constructed, what type of materials go into them, or if they're digital instruments, what kind of programming goes into them, even down to the chips and the converters that are used, the IC chips and different things that make them, the transformers that make them sound a certain way, or maybe distort the sound, and things like that, vacuum tube compression, and, what kind of tubes are good for what sort of instruments and things like that. We can go on and on and on and on. I can go very far into that world of sound engineering, audio engineering, the technical aspects of music equipment, the technical aspects of sound, right? So you can have a person who has absolutely zero musical training, and that particular person won't be able to tell the difference between a decent musician and a musician who's a master, right? I had a conversation yesterday, actually. I was in the music store and I was picking up something, and I was just playing on an instrument and ended up linking with a really good brother, guitar player, and we started playing together, And he asked me about a particular musician. He's like, "What do you think of so and so?" And I said, "That person is super technical, like beautiful technique." This particular person that he asked about is known for playing really fast. They have a huge social media following. But I said, they don't have any soul in their playing, you know. But their technique is so incredible that they can play so fast and they know that fretboard so well. But playing fast, when you speak about music that really touches people, it's usually the slower you play it, the more touching and soulful it is, you know. Um, but the average person just hears somebody play fast, like, oh, they're amazing, they're the best, they're the greatest, whatever. That's fine. That person doesn't have the competence in that particular area to recognize excellence. It's no different than writing, right? A person who doesn't understand writing is not going to be able to tell the difference between a powerful argument versus a dramatic speech. You know, uh, in the same instance, a person who has never built anything. I'm speaking to business owners, community owners, family builders, right? Building a family is like building a business. A person who's never built anything is not necessarily going to be able to recognize the difference between a real builder and a loud talker. And that matters because many people judge things they do, but they don't have the actual capacity to evaluate. They judge leaders, but they don't have an understanding of what leadership is, right? There are many people who will judge even scholars without even understanding study. Study itself is its own discipline. It's its own art and how to study. And it's more than just reading something and writing notes or making an outline, right? You have people who will judge their parents without understanding sacrifice. You see, I have seen people who have judged spiritual leaders and they have no understanding of discipline. So they don't know why they do what they do. For me as an entrepreneur, I have heard people judge what I do or judge other entrepreneurs, but they have no understanding of risk. So without those things, you're never going to be able to recognize what's in front of you, because a person like a fool cannot see excellence. So when they can't see excellence, they disrespect it. And because and it's not because excellence is absent. The excellence is there, but it's because their perception is underdeveloped. And that's why a fool can stand in front of someone who has way more discipline, someone who has way more experience, someone who has way more study, someone who has sacrificed far more, and the fool will still think, I know better. I know better. That's not a courageous stand. That's blindness. The fool is blind. A person can't properly measure what they've not developed the eyes to see, right? If I tell you we're making some food and I say, hey, go get the measuring cup and, measure out a quart of water, and, you can't see. You can't see the lines where it says a quart, or you don't know the difference between, you can't see the water from the gin. You don't know which one is which. So how do you properly evaluate? You can't. And that's why we need humility. That's why humility becomes so necessary. Humility says there may be levels that I can't perceive yet. So before I dismiss this thing, let me understand it, right? Humility will tell you the fact that I do not see the value in this particular thing doesn't mean that there's no value here. The fool says, I don't see it, so therefore it doesn't exist. I had a friend like that who used to say things like that all the time. I would talk about things or share things with him, and he'd say, I never heard of that. But that was not, I never heard of that. Wow, let me go deeper into it. I never heard of that. So end of conversation. That one assumption of I do not see it, so therefore it does not exist, it destroys whole communities. It destroys whole organizations, movements, relationships, families. It destroys everything. There's another piece to this, and that's, complexity a lot of times can hide a shallow thinker. Not every time you hear a fool does a fool necessarily sound simple. Some fools actually sound complicated when you listen to them. Some people hide confusion behind big words, or they'll use spiritual language. I see this all the time. And I think to some degree in modern culture, other people have started to recognize it because this whole comedy routines, and unfortunately, it's become blasphemous towards real spiritual traditions, you know. But there's whole comedy routines behind people who perform spiritual. You know, the people who use spiritual language, or who use therapeutic language, or they use business language, or they use revolutionary language. But beneath all of that stuff, there is no real understanding. And that's why you have to be so careful, because simple doesn't always mean shallow. Complex also doesn't always mean deep. You know, a clear thinker is something different. A clear thinker can make a deep idea very understandable. And a confused thinker will usually take something that's simple, and they'll take a simple idea and they'll make it sound profound because they don't actually understand it. You find that a lot of times in academia. You know, I see it often in academic speeches. I see it in business practices. I see it in spiritual spaces. People learn the vocabulary of depth without doing the work of depth. It's very common. So people learn how to sound wise or sound strategic, you know, or sound like they're healed. People learn how to sound like they're conscious, but language is not the actual transformation. A person who is healed, um, or a person who's speaking the language of healing, can still be very much ruled by their ego. Very much. You know, just like a person may speak the language of justice, but still be a person who treats people very unfairly. You know, um, I know people who speak leadership language all the time. You know, I listen to them consistently in the different environments that I'm in, but they are totally incapable of correction, right? So the question doesn't, or shouldn't be, how impressive does this sound? It should be, can this person make sense? Can they explain this idea to me plainly? Um, Can they apply this idea consistently? Can they receive correction? You know, can this person acknowledge limits and limitations? You know, if not, then chances are you're not hearing wisdom. Chances are you're just watching or listening to a performance. And one who performs intelligence is, I would say, probably the favorite uh, costume of the ego. It's performed intelligence. You know, you get so many people that way. You know, another aspect to that is that the fool often is immune to correction. I think this is a piece that many people are aware of, you know, and because that's usually the most frustrating part of all of this, right? A fool is very hard to correct because correction requires a person recognize the gap between what they believe and what is true. And some people don't have the mental capacity to know that there is often a gap between those two things, right? Sometimes it's you, right? Um, if a person can't perceive that gap, then correction for them feels like an attack, right? And I say sometimes it's you, sometimes it's me. Like, have you ever been in that place? I have been in that place before, you know, and this is something that we always have to kind of sort of keep in check. You know, have you ever been in a discussion with someone where you've brought evidence, and after you bring the evidence, the person says that's your opinion? There was a time I probably was in those sort of discussions maybe 9, 10 times a month, if not more. If not more, at least maybe even every other day, to be honest. You know, um, or you bring reason to a person and they say that you're overthinking. I have been accused of being an overthinker before. There have been times when I've brought context. You ever been in a situation? You bring context to a situation and someone says you're making excuses, right? Um, or you could be having a conversation, or you're in a situation and you ask a person for patience and they say that you're avoiding accountability. You know, you might ask for truth, and what the other side does is they gather agreement, right? That's why some people, they can't be argued into wisdom, right? They're not looking for truth. Those are people who are protecting their identity and nothing more. That's all they're doing. So when a belief becomes part of someone's identity, right, every correction feels like a threat. You're threatening the very foundations of who I see myself as being. My very identity is wrapped into my belief. But I have not recognized that there may be a chasm, there may be a gap, there may be a gorge, there may be a canyon between belief, what I believe, and what reality actually is. See, that's where the ego becomes very dangerous, right? Because the ego says, if I admit that I don't know something, that I am the blind one in this situation, then I will feel very small. The ego says, if I change my mind, then the people watching may think I was weak all this time. So instead of growing, what the person does is they double down on what they said or what they did or what they didn't say or what they didn't do. They repeat the same claim over and over again. And then what they do is they gather people who agree with that claim. Then they attack the person who is correcting them. They start to rewrite the story. They protect the illusion. And eventually, the lie that they were standing on, it becomes the shelter or, or the house that they now live inside of, right? That's when it becomes captivity, becomes the prison. And that's why doubt, you got to understand, doubt is not weakness. People think if they doubt something, they're weak. They're not. I doubt things all the time. Consistent. I'm a persistent and consistent doubter. Because there is doubt that will cause a person to freeze, and then there is doubt that it will cause a person to become a more functional person. I choose the latter, of course. Doubt can be a form of spiritual and intellectual hygiene, right? So it doesn't have to necessarily paralyze you. There's a disciplined sort of doubt where you ask the kind of questions like, what am I missing here? Right? Um, you could be going through something, you don't start creating mental legends in your mind. You say, okay, wait a minute, what do I actually know? Let me separate what I actually know from the story I'm creating in my head. You know, ask yourself honestly, what are the things that I've assumed? What have I assumed in this situation? You know, I ask myself this question consistently, especially in the midst of any sort of conflict. Who benefits from this version of the story? Right? Um, Another exercise I consistently do, what evidence would change my mind in this situation? Um, I ask, am I seeking truth, or am I just trying to protect my ego? Right? Asking yourself those questions, that's not a weakness, right? I don't consider myself to be a consistently weak person. I'm weak sometimes, you know, as all people are, but I'm a pretty strong person. I ask myself questions like that constantly, right? Those questions are wisdom. That's the wisdom. There's another part to this, and I want to explain why this sort of idea matters so much for growth, and why it matters so much for leadership, right? Because there's no person who can grow beyond the truth that they refuse to face. There's no organization, there's no family, there's no community, there's no relationship that can grow if the people inside are more committed to being right than they are committed to being wise. That's why I speak so often about growth and dynamics, which is the name of my company, but it's named that way for a reason. Growth isn't just like having a bunch of vision boards with arrows pointing up. We're growing, growth, a lot of times that's just ambition. Growth requires correction. Um, Growth also requires reflection. It requires the ability to step outside of your own sort of perception, of your own emotional certainty, and ask yourself, is this actually true? Is it actually true? But you got to be able to step outside of your own emotional certainty. And some people can't do that. When they have a flood of emotions, those emotions stay there for a long time until they convert to feelings, long-standing feelings, and they don't go away. You see, that's not someone who's wise or someone who's ever going to master anything or grow. Then you have the dynamics aspects, and dynamics are very important. Again, growth and dynamics, because every human system is shaped by how people handle and truth, how people handle power, how people handle uh, conflict, and how people handle correction. So in a family, the fool's confidence will always create a lot of chaos. In an organization, you'll have the fool's confidence, and that always creates very bad or very poor organizational decisions. When you have a community and you have fool's confidence, it will always create division, right? I have found in my own experiences in spiritual spaces, the fool's confidence always creates false authority, right? In relationships, the fool's confidence will generally lead to destruction because the person can't tell the difference between their feeling and the truth, right? So that's what I think is one of the greatest errors of our time. People think because they feel very strongly that they must be seeing clearly, right? But an emotion is not evidence. An emotion can alert you to something, but it can tell you that that something needs attention. But an emotion cannot be the final judge of truth. Now, I've heard people use that language before. If it feels right, then go with it. Don't do that. Don't do that. You have to ask yourself why certain things resonate with you and why certain things don't. A mature person honors emotion, but always investigates reality. An immature person feels something and then builds a case around that feeling. That's what we call the fool's confidence, right? So ultimately, we have to ask, what is the answer to all this? The answer is not to become arrogant towards arrogant people. The answer is not to sort of walk around calling everyone foolish, right? I choose through the work that I do um, and how I train and educate and help people and work through my businesses. I choose to become more disciplined with my own certainty, right? Because all of us have areas where we're underdeveloped. We all do. And all of us have areas where we have mistaken familiarity for expertise, right? Um, and we all have areas where our ego tries to protect us from correction. You know, so you don't necessarily have to question who are the fools around me. You know, let me identify the fools. The better question is, where am I most certain? And have I earned that certainty? Have I studied enough? Have I listened enough? Have I tested my own view? Have I heard the strongest argument against my own position? Have I allowed reality to correct me? Because the fool is not just the person who doesn't know. The fool is the person who refuses the path from ignorance to wisdom. The fool just stays on the path of ignorance. And the beginning of wisdom is not being certain about something. The beginning of wisdom is humility, right? So it is the ability that you have to say, I may not know enough yet. I don't have enough information yet, you know, or I need to listen a little longer. I may need to study this more deeply, right? There are times you have to say, hey, man, I need to correct myself, you know, or I need to explore the strength that lies under my discipline, because asking myself critical questions is not a weakness, you know. Schopenhauer, one of the things he kind of really shared was that the human mind a lot of times is trapped by its own limits. But wisdom begins when a person is aware of those limits, not frightened or intimidated or embarrassed by those limits. So before you sort of declare or accuse someone or condemn or follow the crowd, which is so common today, or mistake your feelings for facts, it's important to ask, what do I actually know? What is it that I don't have the capacity yet to see? You know, I think that's even more important than what is it that I actually know? What do I not yet have the capacity to see? That could be very scary, because if you're a person who is obsessed with control, then in that moment you may realize that you don't have the capacity or tools to control what's happening. But that's where growth actually begins. That's where you start to finally become mature. You're stepping into the world of maturity. You know, you're stepping into the world of wise people at that point. And that's how we escape the trappings of the fool's confidence. It's those critical questions, you know. And like I said, I live in doubt. I live in the world of those questions. And that may be scary to some, or it may be surprising. You may say, like, yeah, but you're always teaching and sharing. And yeah, but I've not arrived. Who's arrived? Right? So I just wanted to share that. And willfully, that sparked something very important in you. And we can, as I share more information on this channel and around community building and African-centered industrial and organizational psychology and family building and leadership and growth and dynamics and relationship building, relationship healing, you'll start to understand our starting point has to be humility. And a lot of times we can waste a good portion of our opportunities in life on individuals who don't have the capacity to hold what it is that we're putting down, you know. And instead of spending years, months, whatever it is, being frustrated, sometimes it's important to understand that this individual just doesn't have the integral structure to hold what it is that you're trying to offer. So even though, like I say, you may come with evidence, they may argue things that have no basis, that have no fact. They're just repeating claims. Then they go run and they find flying monkeys to agree. Right. Does this make sense to you? You know, some people only see a very shallow piece and they don't go into the depths. They're scared to go into the depths. So they find other shallow people, and you could end up very frustrated or feeling very lonely, you know, like, I know I'm not wrong here, and I'm bringing evidence, I'm bringing facts. People saying it's not that deep, or I'm going too far, or all of these different things. You're not wrong. You're not wrong. The fool is always blind to the master. That's all. Yes, it's frustrating, but it's only frustrating because you've decided to engage in that dance. And I would encourage you, don't dance. Put your back up on the wall. Don't dance. Let the fool go out there and do what the fool does. And if they choose to live a happy, what they consider to be happy, because it's only short term, because there's no growth in that. But like when they say ignorance is bliss, if they choose to live in their bliss, then let it be so. You know, if they don't want to grow their ignorance into wisdom through critical and disciplined study and questioning and inquiry, then that's that, right? Go find another master. Find another one who's interested in growth and dynamics. And when you're speaking about family, that's how you build long-term wealth and legacy. Masters need to link with masters. In a very simple way, you've heard me say before, as it was given to me by an elder, you can't mate a racehorse with a jackass. All right. Thank you for tuning in. I am Yuya Assaan-ANU, and this has been great. And I have so much more coming for you in this particular lane. And I'll probably double up on my Chief Yuya channel. I'm going to explore this more, but I'm going to explore the spiritual side of it. All right. So here I spoke about more of the self-development, psychological side, but there is a spiritual aspect to this as well. That's a part of my wisdom and growth. I look at things from multiple angles and prove it, show and prove from multiple angles, and find evidence from multiple angles instead of just staying in one very narrow path. All right. So you'll probably see a video for those of you who are subscribed on Chief Yuya. You'll see a video over there as well. So. All right, everyone. Enjoy your day.